Welcome to the 100th Monkey Radio with Tom and Ramon, minus the Ramon tonight. He's actually, believe it or not, he's teaching English to Japanese kids. So, Ramon, when you hear this, good job, bud. Ramon, he knows I love him, even though I do give him crap all the time. So, we've been, this world is just busy. The energy has been absolutely amazing. This week is, I don't know, there's been a kind of a real brightness in the air this week. That's the best way I can describe it. It's just the energy has felt very light. And as a matter of fact, right now, today here in Weston, Washington, we are recording this Friday evening on March 22nd. And I've got nice blue skies with some fluffy white clouds, the real clouds, not the chemtrail clouds, and it's just absolutely gorgeous and feels wonderful. Oh, let's see, we've got all the standard stuff you guys can find is on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Vimeo, all those normal places. I'd like to also mention our Tuesday night show on the Truth Frequency Radio Network is no longer going to be Tuesday night. We are moving to Saturdays at 7 o'clock from 7 to 9 on the Truth Frequency. So I hope you guys can tune in over there and check us out live. Let's see, www.the100thmonkeyradio.com. And we have tonight with us somebody who's done some absolutely amazing work for quite a few years out in this wonderful place we call planet Earth. Mr. Neil Slade is with us tonight. He has been, he's been busy. He's been writing books and making music, and he's done some absolutely amazing work with and research on the brain. He's written some books. One of them is Tickle Your Amygdala, I believe it is. The Frontal Lobes Supercharge, The Secret of the Dormant Brain Lab, et cetera, et cetera. I think he's got 7 books on the brain at least, and he's got at least that many. He's got 10 original albums to his credit. He's been very busy, and I'll tell you what, I caught this guy a few years back, and intrigued me back then, but I kind of got sidetracked off into all other stuff. And when Ramon brought his name across my desk again, and I started poking around back into his material, I just really see what he's doing has the value it can have to so many people right now who are waking up and really trying to get things straight within their lives and to prosper and to move forward and to grow and to help this world become the beautiful place that we know it can be. Mr. Neil Slade, welcome to the 100th Monkey Radio.
Ohio gozaimasu.
That's for you, Ramon.
I should have said mushi mushi when you answered the phone. Isn't that right?
You know what? It's all Greek to me.
Well, I got to tell you, I was so pleased to get your phone call and make that connection with Ramon. And I'm sorry we couldn't talk. I am a huge fan of Japanese cinema. And right now we're going through all the Yuzajiro Ozu films right now, who is little known in the United States, but extremely well known in Japan and well respected there. So hopefully I'll get a chance to speak directly with Ramon sometime about Japanese culture. And I just want to say hi to all my Japanese fans across the ocean, as well as my fans wherever they may be.
Yeah, my Japanese cinema viewing is pretty limited. I think I watched some Godzillas and some Rowohlt and those back in the day, But besides that, they've I can't believe the anime they've put out here in the last 20 years. Some absolutely amazing work.
Miyazaki is just the best.
Oh man!
And there's a few others too of that caliber. I mean, we could do a whole show on Japanese cinema as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
But anyway,
But we're here to
It's a real
talk.
pleasure to be here.
Yeah, we're here to talk about the brain, though, and all the associating factors, which pretty much covers the whole thing, Japanese cinnamon included. But so I think from what I can tell, probably your biggest claim to fame is the tickle your amygdala thing.
Yeah.
So for those who may not know, what exactly is the amygdala?
Well, most people do know that their brain is divided in half into two hemispheres. And there's a couple of different models of the brain that work to kind of delineate what happens in the various portions of the brain. Paul MacLean came up with this triune brain model back in the early 60s. Richard Restak, who did a PBS series called The Brain, his model was kind of a binary division of the brain rather than a triune brain. And they're both valid and they're both useful in different ways. Let me explain Restek first. He says you can divide your brain, and we'll get to the amygdala.
Right.
And once I describe the brain basics, then you'll understand what the function of the amygdala is. So Richard Restak, a neurologist, says you can divide the brain into two halves, one being reflective half and one being the reactive half. So half of our brain is dedicated to reacting to our environment. In other words, it senses the environment, it senses how we feel internally as well, and it goes on automatic programming and automatic reactions. And so the brain does things that you don't have to think about. Your five senses, they feel, they hear, they touch, they see, right? And you don't have to think about it. It just happens. You just react. And similarly, you react to cues from the environment. Either you feel like you're being rewarded by the environment in which you are attracted to things, or you feel like you are threatened by the environment in which you are repelled by things. Okay? So that's half the brain, the reactive brain, the automatic part of the brain. Now, that part of the brain is typically in the lower and back portion of your skull. All right? Now, the other half of your brain he calls the reflective brain. And that part of your brain would be more upper and towards the front of your brain and towards the outside of the brain. The reactive brain is more towards the inside, as it were, the core of the brain. The reflective brain is the outer layers of the brain and the further forward parts of the brain. And that is the part of the brain that you can consciously control. That's the thinking part of your brain, where you could do math or language, or you consciously make decisions. You reflect on things. You might have abstract thoughts. You might, just kind of play with your brain in that sense. Okay.
Now, isn't that also the newest part of the brain, as far as what we understand is of our evolution?
Yes, right. And so what Restek does, the more primitive parts of the brain, he would call the reactive brain. And the more advanced part of the brain, he would call the reflective part of the brain. And that correlates to, those areas of the brain known by neuroscience to compute more advanced behaviors. And you can get a little better understanding of what Restek is talking about when you look at Paul MacLean's model of the brain, which is a little bit older. It goes back to the 60s. He says the human brain is three brains in one. It's a triune brain. So the innermost part of the brain, the most primitive part, he calls the reptile brain. And that's the part of our brain that allows us to function on the same level as as reptiles. That's what he calls it, the reptile. In other words, it's emotionless, it's reactive, it doesn't reflect. Okay? So the inner core of the brain, which corresponds to the R complex, or it's where the brain stem, it's where your spinal cord comes out of the brain. It's the most inner part of the brain. It's like the seeds of an apple. Okay, if we were to make that analogy.
Okay.
So the reptile brain by Gleam is kind of like the seeds of the apple. It's the most inner part, and it's small. It's kind of like it's like if you were to make a fist with your hand. That's what it looks like. And then how your spinal cord comes out is like your forearm. Okay, so it's a unitary core part of your brain. That's called the reptile brain. Now, surrounding that, you have another layer, which he calls the mammal brain. Scientifically, it's called the limbic system. And what that part of the brain does is it adds on these processes of emotions and nurturing and very basic social behaviors. All right? And that's kind of like the core of the apple around the seeds, as it were. All right? Now, the fruity part of the apple and the skin is the outermost part of the brain, which scientists call the primate brain. Hey, Chloe! Chloe's reptile brain is now reacting. Did you hear her?
Yes, I did.
She's reacting to a threat that she perceives on the sidewalk out front. So that was her reptile brain. And when she kisses me on the face, she's licking me with her mammal brain, that cooperative part of the brain, or one of the cooperative parts of the brain. So the mammal brain adds on another layer, and it adds on the, I said that. I explained that already.
Right.
The nurturing and the social behaviors and the emotions. Okay. The outer layer, called the primate brain, when we look at like Frankenstein's brain in a jar, we see all that wiggly...
the worms.
The worms.
Yeah.
That's the primate brain. And we're actually, the gray matter makes up about 1/6 of an inch layer on the outside, and then you've got about an inch of white matter called glial cells underneath of that. And the primate brain in the frontal lobes, which is the front third of the brain, adds on the most advanced types of functions of the brain. In humans, that's where we compute math, that's where we have our abstract thinking, that's where we have the high motor control. We have a motor strip there that allows us fine motor control. The frontal lobes is the most advanced part of your primate brain. And the frontal lobes is kind of like if you were to hold on to your whole forehead with your fingers outstretched. Everything under your hand in the front part of your skull, under your forehead, that's called the frontal lobes. And that adds on the most advanced thinking. And I made up an anagram for that, which I call CICIL, C-I-C-I-L. And the frontal lobes compute creativity, imagination, the highest levels of cooperation, high intuition, and logic. So C-I-C-I-L, creativity, imagination, cooperation, intuition, and logic. And that's the most advanced part of your brain. That's where all your concepts of time come from. That's where your abstract imaging comes from. That's where you understand cause and effect. That's where the highest levels of cooperation and empathy come from. It's where the highest levels of logic come from. So that's the frontal lobes, okay? So now that we know what that triune brain looks like an apple, with the reptile brain in the middle, with a layer of the core around the seeds, which is the mammal brain, and then the juicy, delicious part, which is your frontal lobes and primate brain, all right? Right in the middle of each of your brain hemispheres, because your mammal brain and primate brain are divided in half. You've got a left hemisphere and right hemisphere. Each hemisphere has a little kind of magical button called the amygdala, and it's located 1 inch inside each temple, right kind of in between. You could draw a line dissecting from your ear to your eye, and right where those two lines from your ear, the top of your ear, and the back of your eyeball would meet, that's where each amygdala would be. And what the amygdala is, it's kind of like a rheostat. It's like a multiple, you know those dimmer switches that turn on light bulbs?
Right.
That you could turn them all the way up, right, and all the electricity goes up to the ceiling, right? Or you could turn them all the way back, and none of the electricity gets to the light at all, right?
Right.
So the amygdala, right, the amygdala is connected to both the most primitive part of your brain and it's connected to the most advanced part of your brain because it's situated physically right in between those two. And so the function of the amygdala is either to generate, is to send a lot of energy back to that reptile brain and to crank up the reptile brain into fight or flight or counterattack behaviors, right? We just heard Chloe barking, right? So for an instant there, her amygdala clicked backwards, and she started barking at the other dog invading her territory, right? She clicked into reptile brain. That was a good demonstration. Good timing, Chloe. All right? Now, if I were to say, you want a cookie? Right? Oh, all of a sudden her ears come up and her tail's wagging, and she's now clicked into her frontal lobes because she could imagine getting a good, tasty treat and cooperating with me, right? So then her amygdala clicked forward into her frontal lobes. And the difference in emotions are very obvious. When your amygdala clicks backward into your reptile brain, you feel negative emotions or boredom. But when your amygdala clicks forward into frontal lobes, you feel pleasure. See, it's like a switch. When it's off, you feel you're in the dark, and when it's on, it turns the light on, and you have pleasure. You see the difference? So that's basically what that amygdala is, kind of a master click switch that either turns on frontal lobe goodies or it turns on reptile brain pain. That's what the amygdala is. So the trick here is you want to tickle your amygdala consciously and keep it clicked forward so you get the reward, right?
So one real quick question. Is there a difference between the right and left amygdala?
Yeah, and the difference is in the function. I shouldn't chew ice while I'm on the air, overseas especially. Okay. Unless the show goes to Alaska, and then that would be very proper. Okay. Yes, because the right brain functions they're generalizations,
right?
That you can make, but they're only generalizations about the right brain and the left brain. But they're true to a good extent. The right brain functions are typically global. They're fuzzy. In other words, they see the big picture. They see the whole picture of things, but the right brain doesn't see details. The right brain is nonverbal. It understands spatial relationships. The right brain, in most people, computes things like music and art. Okay, the left brain does the opposite. It sees very focused details. It computes linear types of thought like math and language. Now, here's a good analogy that I knew. Your right brain and your left brain can both work at the same time. So, for example, a bird lands on the ground to eat some seeds he sees on the ground. The right brain is keeping a lookout for a hungry fox. It's kind of noticing what the bird's whole environment is, okay? But the bird is also at the same time focused on a little point on the ground, so where that little seed is, right? Because that's what he wants to eat. But both those parts, you can't sneak up on the bird because a bird's right brain is aware of the global environment, right? The problem happens is when you exclusively use either one hemisphere or the other and neglect to use the other half. In the case of a bird, if all he did was to use his left brain and focused on the seed, he'd be easy prey for a fox, right? Because he wouldn't even notice if something was sneaking up on him.
Right.
That would be it. But on the other hand, if all he used was his right brain, it couldn't concentrate on where to peck for food. So for us humans, it's very important. It's important for everybody, even birds. It's important to keep both that right and left hemisphere balanced, so you perceive both the global environment and you see the big picture, but you also can focus on a small task and see details. So I'm sorry. I'll shut up here in a second. So the right amygdala controls is concerned with the right brain reptile functions and the right brain frontal lobes functions, right? With all those, that's your right amygdala deals with the right brain function, where your left amygdala deals with those left brain functions.
Okay. So let's get into tickling it then.
Okay.
So it is the kind of the way I understand it, and I started to talk about this before we got going here tonight. I kind of understand it as basically creative visualization. You visualize the amygdala switching, and then you focus on say a good emotion or a good a good outcome, et cetera, et cetera. Something happy or positive, or a good goal. Now, something that I naturally evolved into myself in my own spiritual progression was, I started to understand the functions of the brain, the right and the left brain, and how to that the communication between them in our society is less than what is possible, and has to do with all the different conditionings and programming and stuff that we go through. Now, so understanding that, I kind of used that creative visualization within myself, and instead I didn't focus on just the amygdalas myself. I focused on the whole brain, and basically I saw within my mind's eye, I would picture basically a net growing between both sides and creating pathways, and I energized it, so to say. So I visualized like an electrical current that was just vibrating my brain. I got to where when I do it now, I actually have a physical sensation of the whole brain vibrating. So
as you described that, I did exactly that, and I do have that ability to kind of tickle forward, and I can feel that vibration, and it's kind of a orgasmic kind of
right
inside the brain.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, it can be a physical sensation, and many people can do that, but it doesn't have to be a physical sensation.
Right.
So if people are tickling their amygdala, it may or may not immediately result in a physical feeling, although many people have that, but it's not necessary. A lot of times you'll tickle your amygdala, and it'll be a very subtle change in how your brain is working, but ultimately it will result in a monumental change in how you're functioning within your environment and how things are working out for you.
So what are we doing? I'm sure you've worked this out. What are we actually doing when we do tickle our amygdala?
Well, that was one thing that I had written my first book called The Frontal Lobes Supercharge back in 1989, and every year I would revise it, so it's like in its 7th edition right now, and I kept learning stuff. And last year I finally decided I wanted to write a whole new book, and I wanted to expand what tickling your amygdala meant, because it means different things to different people. So I started talking to people all over the world, some of them very famous. I talked to Terry Jones, who was one of the founding members of Monty Python. I talked to Josh Blue, who was a winner of NBC's Last Comic Standing. I talked to Dr. Lawrence Blair, who many people may know from his Ring of Fire series that was on PBS. He's an anthropologist in Indonesia. I talked to Nancy Talbot, who is one of the foremost experts in crop circles and UFO phenomenon. I talked to 56 people all over the world, people who were experts in their field, because I knew people were tickling their amygdala in a lot of different ways. And so the consequence of that was a book called Tickle Your Amygdala. So if people go to my website, and I'll plug myself here, brainradar.com. They go to brainradar.com, they'll see a picture of the Tickle Your Amygdala book. And so that book, I wanted to really update and define what it meant. And so everybody tickles their amygdala in a different way. And the thing is to know what works best for you and what works for somebody else to tickle your amygdala, and to click this switch forward to turn on your goody spot in your right and left hemisphere. It may be the same as one person, or it may be different. And so I was given a lot of new information. Terry Jones tickled his amygdala through the use of humor, as did Josh Blue. Dr. Lawrence Blair tickled his amygdala through his anthropological discoveries and explorations, people do it in a lot of different ways. What you described earlier was to use your imagination and your process of abstract imagery to tickle the amygdala.
Right.
And for example, you could imagine a feather inside your skull, and with the tip of your feather, you can touch it to your left amygdala and go tickle, 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 and that'll tickle that amygdala forward. And if you were on a brain scanning machine, you would see an increase in frontal lobes processes in your brain. And they've actually done that at Harvard University, where they had people do different amygdala. They didn't call it amygdala tickling, but that's in fact what was going on. So the brain scan would show the amygdala being activated through abstract imagery and what would happen. So that's one way to tickle your amygdala. But you don't have to tickle your amygdala just by imagining something. I spoke at great length with a fellow who tickled his amygdala by using a tuning fork. He would hold. This was a fellow who was Stevie Wonder's principal piano technician for 10 years, and he was a musician. So he used a physical tuning fork that he would hold to the points on the outside of his head that corresponded to the amygdala and frontal lobes. And by physically holding the tuning fork onto the right places on his skull, that's how he would tickle his amygdala. I talked to a guy in Belgium named Tom Myers. He tickled his own amygdala and his patients. He was an osteopath, by placing his hands in the appropriate places on their cranium. Other people can tickle their amygdala by by writing. Other people can do it by using music. So there's an infinite number of ways to do it. The trick is to be able to identify your own amygdala and how it feels, and then discover for yourself, either by looking at other people's experiences, as I may explain in the book, or by inventing your own way to tickle your amygdala. So there's a lot of different ways to do it. It's not limited to just imagination. It's not limited to physical manipulation. There's a lot of different ways. You just got to know what the amygdala does and where it is and what happens when you tickle it.
So what are some of the effects that people see out of doing this and clicking it forward and clicking it back? What are the two extremes there?
Yeah, well, I say clicking backward and tickling forward. When you click backward into reptile brain, you feel negative emotion. When your amygdala is clicked backwards, you're either bored or you feel like crap. And that's what the brain does. When you're clicked backwards, you have negative feelings. Your creativity stops. You feel fearful. You feel anxiety. You feel emotional pain. You can feel physical pain. So that's what happens when your amygdala is clicked backward. When your amygdala is tickled forward, it's pleasurable. Your creativity skyrockets. You are able to get along with people. When your amygdala is clicked backwards, all you can do is fight with people, right? So the trick is to have conscious control over your amygdala. If you don't know what your amygdala does, if you don't know where it is, it's kind of like a broken light switch that's flicking forward and backward in the wind, depending on how the wind is blowing. Animals, like typically lower animals, don't have any conscious control over their amygdala. Their amygdala clicks backward or forward depending on what's going on in the environment. Whereas humans can have conscious control, and they can tickle their amygdala out of sheer will. Even when the environment is really crummy, you can still tickle your amygdala and feel pleasure. And that's the reward of knowing how to tickle your amygdala. You're not limited by what the environment is feeding you.
Right. So what kind of science has been? I'm sure that I know you mentioned that there were that they did something. What was it? Harvard, you said,
Yeah.
a study there, and looked at some of the different effects were they consciously trying to activate the amygdala, or were they just doing a stimulus response thing?
Well, the two things that I think. First of all, I studied with a guy named T.D. Lingo, and I learned all of my brain basics. I was his right-hand man. I was an assistant at the Dormant Brain Lab for 11 years. And this was a wilderness facility that people would go, and they would spend 6 weeks, and they would study, and they would do self-experimentation, and he would do observational science. And people would basically go to Brain in Nature camp on his 300 acres of wilderness, and they'd camp out, and they'd study a neurology text. They would do yoga. They would do meditation. They would do journal keeping. And the goal would be for them to learn how to tickle their amygdala. And so the Brain Lab was one of the first places that I know of, and it may be the first place that there was that was dedicated to brain self-control and self-control of the amygdala specifically. So his focus was really on the function of the amygdala at the Brain Lab. And I wrote about that. If people are interested in my experience at the Brain Lab, there's a book called The Book of Wands, and it's a 4-volume set that I just released. I spent about 5 years developing this book, and people can go to brainradar.com, and there's a link to the Book of Wands. So that talks about my experience at the Dormant Brain Lab and what that program was all about in discovering what the amygdala did and how people could control the amygdala and tickle it forward. All right. Now, the other thing that I think of was a 9-year, it's either 9 or 10-year study from, I think it was 1999 to 2009. And this was at Harvard University. And this was headed up by a team of researchers, among them a woman named Sarah Lazar, and then a guy named Dr. Herbert Benson, which some people may know from a book called The Relaxation Response. And they were basically doing a very similar thing. They wanted to learn what tickled people's amygdala, okay? But they did it by doing brain scans of people who, for example, would do meditative types of exercises, and then they would do brain scans while people were doing meditation or these relaxation experiments. And what they would find is that these different kinds of exercises would tickle they would see the amygdala light up in conjunction with an increase in frontal lobes processes. And then these people would feel these pleasurable sensations. They'd feel sensations of peace, and they would be able to kind of turn down the reptile response and turn up the frontal lobes response. So they were indirectly looking at what would tickle the amygdala and turn on, the advanced frontal lobes in persons' brains. And they did it using brain scan machinery. And this was in contrast to Lingo's work here in Colorado, which did not use brain scanning. It was more as a observational self-analysis and kind of life in the real world as opposed to being hooked up to a machine. So those were two different kinds of ways of looking at amygdala tickling and brain self-control.
Yeah. So there's a huge, it's getting really big out there right now. People doing that inner work, that self-work of getting themselves right, in their spiritual path, in their path of consciousness.
Well, I've always been interested. I used to teach yoga and meditation, so I've also been interested in that. But I've also wanted to know what's the hardcore science. I didn't want to just look at this phenomenon from a wishful thinking or a religious or faith-based thing, which I think is fine. I wanted to know, what's the hardwire machinery doing when we're doing meditation or when we're doing visual imagery.
Right, right.
And there was something that let me just say one more thing. You mentioned how the brain was wired up. If people go online right now, there's a $30 million study going on right now with some very new technology, which is showing color imagery of the ways that one part of the brain communicates with other parts of the brain. And it's a new brain mapping research that's just begun, and people can probably see some wonderful images of that online if they're interested in seeing how the brain is wired up.
Yeah, the point I was making is that there's a huge. I'm seeing a big parallel here between what the type of work that you're talking about and that positive attitude, in the woo-woo world. That positive thinking idea. I'm saying, what they're doing there when they try to focus on the positive outcome, the manifestation thing, the getting their own desires, fulfilling their desires, the happiness, et cetera, and basically they're tickling their amygdala there also, wouldn't you think?
Yes. But I'll say that with reservation.
Right.
You have to think about balancing the brain. And when a person gets too caught up in fulfilling material desires, then you can actually be clicking backwards into your reptile brain, which computes what lingo used to call eggs behaviors. Ego, greed, grab, suck, right? You're thinking, what can I get for me, me, me? The reptile brain just computes me, 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 competitive behaviors. So if you're sitting around thinking, okay, I'm going to win the lotto, and I'm going to be a millionaire, and if I think that hard enough, then I'll get the winning lotto numbers, right? So, the book, The Secret, that's what that was all about. Was getting stuff for you, for me, me, me. And that's not tickling forward at all, right? Tickling forward means to think about the big picture. Your frontal lobes can understand not only what's important to you as an individual, but how you, as a little teeny tiny speck in the universe, fit into the whole big scheme of things, right? So, just because you're using your imagination, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're tickling forward. You've got to see, the big picture, and that's why it's important to think both in terms of right brain and left brain. See, you can focus on something for yourself, but you also have to see yourself in the big picture as well. So, Hitler thought of a million different ways to kill people. He was very good at imagining.
Right.
I'm laughing. It's not really a laughing matter. There are very creative people who use their imagination in a very destructive way.
Right.
So as you learn about the brain, and that's why learning about the physical brain is useful, because you realize that, well, here's a part of your brain, the frontal lobes, that has to do with empathy. It's called the prefrontal medial cortex. And that allows you to feel what other people feel, right? So when you study the brain, you learn about the prefrontal cortex and think, well, if you're going to use your whole brain, you got to have that part of your brain turned on as well. And if all you're thinking about is, oh, I imagine myself in a big mansion with $1 million in the bank, hey, that part of your brain is shut off. So it's helpful to know what each one of these regions of the brain is responsible for. And so then you don't fool yourself into thinking you're tickling your amygdala. You know when you really are tickling your amygdala forward.
So have you noticed, I'm sure you have, but I would like to hear your words for it. People who are consciously focusing on the amygdala versus people who are just focusing the same intent. Say the intention is to have a hellacious belly laugh. Okay, so So one person is just has the focus and the intent to do that, which may trigger the amygdala, and one has the focus of channeling this through the amygdala, or focusing on the amygdala as the switch or the trigger to bring this about. Have you noticed a difference in the results between those two types?
I would say so. And I think what you're talking about is knowing how the engine works. And my favorite analogy is with a car. Okay? So let's say you've got a car, right? And you want to get from your side of town to the other side of town. Well, if you don't know what the brake is, if you don't know where the accelerator pedal is, if you don't know where to put the gear shift, if you don't know where to put the gas, the likelihood of you getting from your side of town to the other side of town is going to be not too great, right? But if somebody says, hey, listen, here's where the key goes, and when you turn the key, this connects to the battery to the spark plug, and here's the brake, and here's where you put the gas. So it's really helpful to know some basic information about how the car is put together, right? You're going to have a lot better chances of getting across town if you know how the car works, if you know right, rather than if you're guessing. Well, the human brain is the same way. If you know a little bit about how your brain is put together, right, if you know what the frontal lobes do versus what the reptile brain does, if you know what the amygdala does, and you don't have to know a lot. I mean, you can learn these brain basics in a half an hour of reading and looking at pictures. Your chances that your brain is going to take you to where you want to go is going to be infinitely greater than if you don't know how your brain works. So I say, hey, spend a little bit of time and learn how your brain works. And I get, I've gotten something like 12 million unique visitors on my website in the past 15 years. So I get a lot of feedback from people. And invariably, people, both highly educated people and also people who may not have a very high conventional education, artists, doctors, publishers, scientists, invariably people tell me that, hey, once I learned where my amygdala was and what the difference between my mammal brain and my reptile brain was, my brain worked a lot better. So that's all I'm saying, and that's been my observation, is once you learn a few brain basics and once you understand what tickling the amygdala is, the hard facts of it is your brain is going to be able to take you to where you want to go much better than if you're blindfolded and if you're just guessing. I'm not putting down any other method. I'm not putting down people who play music or people who can laugh or people who do physical exercise. You do all that stuff, but at the same time you can also learn what your brain is and supercharge whatever it is that you're doing. Knowledge never hurt anybody.
Right. What about the brain chemistry and the chemistry that's associated with the amygdala? Is there anything in particular or anomalous there that would be interesting?
Well, the amygdala is in the limbic system, so this is kind of this middle layer of the mammal, this middle layer of the brain, the limbic system, or the mammal brain, and it's tied in with all of these pleasure centers within the brain. When you take a drug like cocaine or heroin, or when you naturally trigger on natural opiates called endorphins and enkephalins within the brain. Hey, Chloe, tickle forward, please. I'm on the phone. This is Flea goes. She sits all day on her chair and watches for everyone walking by. And this is her idea of a good time. So maybe she's not clicking backwards. This is her idea of a good time. She says, I'm a dog. This is what I do.
Exactly. I've got 3 Chihuahuas. I know what you're talking about.
Well, these guys are Westies, and you can see them on my website, and they're in all my books, too, anyway. But let's see. So the amygdala is right within all these pleasure sites within the brain. So when you take a drug, it plugs into areas that are right adjacent to the amygdala. And the amygdala also functions as an anti-anxiety center. One of the more interesting new bits of amygdala research was that the conventional wisdom is, if you look in Time magazine when they talk about the amygdala and all USA Today, the amygdala is the fear button in our brain. Well, that's not even half the story. It does turn on, when it's clicked backward, it does turn on fight or flight and fear. But it also is responsible for turning on pleasure and anti-anxiety. And one of the research experiments came out last year that showed people who had damaged or missing amygdalas. Oh, there's your Chloe.
There's mine.
They must have heard Chloe there.
Yeah, I think the kids are walking down the alley.
When even if you don't have, if your amygdala is damaged or missing, you can still experience all of these negative emotions. Those parts of it's the connector. The amygdala is greatly responsible for pleasurable sensations in the brain as well. So when it's tickled forward, you're rewarded. And it's kind of how Mother Nature designed it. When you're clicked into your reptile brain, you're only using a very small percentage physically, volume-wise. Your reptile brain only makes up 10% of your brain volume. So when you're clicked into fight or flight, most of your brain is turned off. Okay? But when you tickle your amygdala, it allows the neurochemical activity to expand into the frontal lobes and into the more advanced parts of your brain, and you're using more of your brain. You're using more of your brain power, and that's good for your survival. The more of your brain you use, the better your chances of survival, and Mother Nature knows this. So when you turn on more of your brain, you get reward. You feel pleasurable sensations. And so Mother Nature has designed the amygdala and the brain very cleverly. When you tickle it forward and turn on your frontal lobes, you feel pleasure. And when you are clicked backward and you're in fight or flight, and when you're in combat mode, you feel negative emotion. And in that way, Mother Nature discourages you from using a limited part of your brain, and it encourages you through pleasure to turn on the most advanced parts of your brain.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So, what kind of effects do the different drugs have? What about the entheogens, the hallucinogens? What kind of an effect do they have through the amygdala?
Well, I think anyone who's ever taken something like that, whether it be LSD or mushrooms or DMT, they'll know that you can have a bad trip and you can have a good trip, right? What those types of drugs tend to do is just they crank up the fire, as it were. They stoke the fire in the brain. If your amygdala is clicked forward, you have a good trip, and you see God, and you feel like you're one with the universe. But if your amygdala is clicked backwards, you have the most severe fear and paranoia, and you have a bad trip, right? So the drugs themselves don't tickle the amygdala forward. They may do that accidentally or inadvertently, and you'll have a good trip. But the opposite can happen too, depending upon what Timothy Leary would call your set and setting.
Right.
There were some experiments done at the University of New Mexico, I believe, for a number of years, where the researcher used DMT.
Rupert Sheldrake.
Yeah, okay. Well, I don't think it was Rupert Sheldrake who was doing that.
No. What's his name? I know exactly who you're talking about. I see his face in my mind right now.
Yeah, and DMT, makes LSD kind of look like a sweet tart.
Right.
DMT is the drug, and it's a natural occurring drug within the brain, as it turns out, and it may be made up. It's in connection with the pituitary gland, but it's the most intense visual psychedelic known. And he did experiments with DMT in patients, and invariably, most people had a very positive, although very intense experience with the DMT. They came out of it with a very positive experience. So, I don't think you can really generalize about the use of chemicals and whether or not it tickles the amygdala forward or if it clicks it backward. I think they tend to be more or less neutral, and how you come into that and what kind of experience you have using chemicals has more to do with who you are as a person and how you deal with intense stimulation as opposed to something inherent in the chemical itself. On the other hand, chemicals like the opiates, they'll tend to provide pleasurable experiences within the brain, but invariably you'll have a rebound effect. You'll have kind of a reality hangover. And that's true of a lot of things, whether it's alcohol, not so much with marijuana, which tends to be fairly neutral in terms of having a hangover types of effect. But the opiates and cocaine and, of course, methamphetamines, they make you feel really good on the outset, but then you've got the reality hangover and the withdrawal later on, and it's like a rubber band. You feel worse than you did after you did it. Not so with tickling the amygdala. When you learn brain self-control and you tickle the amygdala, there's no reality hangover later on. So it's just, it's marvelous. It's just like there's just a, tickling your amygdala has nothing but a positive result. And the reason for that is when you tickle your amygdala, you're really using the most advanced part of your brain. When you're addicted to a drug or when you're using a drug to tickle your amygdala, you're really not using the most advanced part of your brain. You're negating the dependence and the negative withdrawal of the use of chemical substances. So,
yeah, you're kind of taking a shortcut past the consciousness end of it, the conscious, intentional end of it.
Yeah. I'm certainly not. I'm not a person that say no to drugs. I'm not an anti-drug guy. I don't promote them, and I don't discourage them. Drugs tend to be kind of a neutral substance in most cases, with some exceptions. It's how you handle it.
Exactly.
Opiates. If you're going to go in for surgery, you want to have opiates.
Exactly.
Right? It depends how you're using the substance. It's kind of like the analogy is a knife. A knife can be used to heal or can be used to kill. And drugs, I think, are the same way as are most physical things. It's how you wield the tool. And, I kind of get into that with the Book of Wands. It's how you use the tool that's important, not so much that there's any one thing defined by a tool.
Yeah, I'm really in alignment with you as far as your outlook on drugs. I mean, I'm not pro or con. I am pro-choice. I think each person should have sovereignty and the ability to do whatever the hell they want to with their own body.
I'm with you 100%.
Yeah.
100% on that.
Yeah. So we've just got a couple minutes left here in this first segment, and I'd like to give you another opportunity to do that shameless plug of your books and your websites. And are you speaking anywhere, or got anything coming up in the near future?
I'm sort of a homebody. My favorite place to be is at home with Irfine Chloe and my wife Julia Liu, and I love communicating through the world, through the internet. And so I don't travel that much. We did a trip to Canada last year, or in 2011, I guess it was. I've just come out with the 4-book set of the Book of Wands. People can go to brainradar.com and they can see pictures of the Tickle Your Amygdala book. And I've got a great new book out. This was a lot of stuff has come out in the past couple months. There's a book called Brain Magic 2, Creativity from Another Dimension. And that's a book that I put together with Julia Liu, my wife, who is an extraordinary artist, if I do say so in my own prejudiced way. And I combined a book that I wrote that has 68 brain game exercises that will tickle your amygdala. That's the first half of the book. And then the second half of the book is Julia Liu explaining creativity from another dimension and how she gets into her own creative spaces and, in fact, how she accesses paranormal sensitivity in her own methods. And so that's a real fun book. But you can read and see samples of all those books at brainradar.com.
That one sounds very interesting. Very interesting. Well, I want to get into the Book of the Wands in the next hour, and we'll continue. We'll just keep plugging along here, and there's some fascinating stuff. I'm very grateful to have you on here. So I want to thank everybody for listening, and be sure to hit that join button on www.the100thmonkeyradio.com and become a member and check out all of our second hour content. If you are listening on YouTube, I just said the website, and you can pop on over there. Love you guys, and we will talk to you in the second hour. Condemnation without investigation is the height of ignorance. And since Ramon isn't here, I will say it for him. The love you deny is the pain you carry. Namaste.
Solve the problems that divide the world of black and white. To end the racism, we've got to fight. So